welcome back. I can see that there are lots of familiar names in the list here, and a couple new folks, perhaps. Again, this is the time where I apologize a little bit to folks who were really familiar with our intros, because I'm going to repeat myself with a few introductions to get us all started. So my name is Haley Ross, for those of you who don't know me, and I work with the Columbia Mountains Institute, or CMI for short. And I'm here with Kendall Benish with the KCP, or the Kootenay Conservation Program. And of course, we have joined forces for what has been a really great webinar series. And we're on our 6th talk today out of 7. So really trucking along. And what we've been doing, I'm just going to change my slide here so you can see what we have been doing and what's coming up. Is presenting a series on the theme of foundations of resilience, understanding departures from historical ecosystems and adapting for resilient futures. So we've had, or we will have had, 7 speakers who are drawing on patterns from the past, challenges in the present, and scenarios for the future to explore adapting ecosystems for resilience in the Columbia Basin. This year's CRED Talks and KCP's winter webinar series are financially supported by the Columbia Basin Trust. So thank you very much to the Trust for that support. And today we'll be welcoming Erik Leslie, who is going to continue to talk about hands-on practical real life activities that we can do to increase resilience in our ecosystems. And I'll introduce him in more detail in just a moment. Before I do that, however, I just want to pause, as we have been, and acknowledge the Indigenous peoples and the land that I am zooming in from today. So for myself personally, I'm in Revelstoke, BC, and this is the homeland of the Sinixt people. And the Shuswap people have also stewarded this land for millennia. The Ktunaxa call this valley, where I'm privileged to live, the land of the chickadee, and in their creation story. And the Syilx also express strong connections to this place. So please, as we have been doing for the benefit of our speaker and for everyone else with us today, take a moment to introduce yourself in the chat. So you can share your name, perhaps the organization that you are working with, and the Indigenous territories that you're zooming in from today. It's a great opportunity to test out that chat. So if you can't find it, hover your mouse at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a little ribbon pop up. You can click on that chat icon. And you might have a chance, you might be using that later for the Q&A, which we'll talk about in just a sec. So as those start to roll in, I'm gonna keep going and tell you a little bit about one of your host organizations, CMI. So Columbia Mountains Institute is a nonprofit association for people working in the various fields of ecology. Our home range is southern British Columbia, Canada, but our membership extends into Alberta, up north, into the Yukon and the Northwest Territories. And one of the main things we do is provide professional development opportunities. So such as webinars, of course, courses, workshops, conferences, and they tackle a variety of subjects, ranging from sort of really technical, skill-based activities to more complex topics that have to do with land management conundrums, and those tend to show up in our conferences. Our website, of course, is a great place to learn more about what we do, and has really great resources, such as recordings from these talks and preceding documents from our larger events. So I encourage you to check that out. That's at cmiae.org. So I'm just going to pass it over to Kendall.
Thank you, Haley. My name is Kendall Benish, and I'm joining you on behalf of Kootenay Conservation Program, or KCP. KCP's work occurs in the unceded, ancestral, and traditional territories of the Ktunaxa, Shuswap, Sinixt, and Syilx Okanagan peoples who've lived here and cared for the land, water, and wildlife since time immemorial. KCP is a broad partnership of 85 land and water conservation and stewardship groups, Indigenous nations, government agencies, resource industries, and agricultural producers working throughout the East and West Kootenays. And our mandate is to coordinate and facilitate conservation efforts on private land and to generate the support and resources needed to maintain those efforts, which includes building technical knowledge through webinars like this. We're very excited to be hosting this webinar series with CMI. and would like to give an additional thanks to our program sponsors, without whom we would not be able to support this type of work. So just a couple final housekeeping details, and then we'll get started. As you've noticed, this webinar is being recorded and it'll be posted to the event webpage within a week, and you're welcome to share it widely. And we ask that you all remain muted unless you're asking a question during the Q&A at the end of the talk. And we'll be using the chat function for the Q&A. So you're welcome to add in questions to the chat anytime, but we won't be addressing those questions until the end of the talk. And that's it from me. Back to you, Haley.
Great, thanks, Kendall. Okay, so now for the reason that you're all here today. So let's introduce Erik Leslie. He's going to be contributing a talk called Climate Adaptation in Action for the Harrop-Procter Community Forest. And what I would like to do is just read a short bio. So Erik is a forestry consultant and a manager. Oh, sorry, I need to advance my slide. There we go. Erik is a forestry consultant and a manager of the Harrop-Procter Community Forest near Nelson, BC. He has worked with community organizations, forest industry, Indigenous peoples, and regional and provincial governments on projects from Hattagwai to Labrador. Erik has extensive experience in forestry planning and operations, community engagement, and small business management. For decades, Erik's work has focused on community-based strategies to address climate change and reduce wildfire risk. So Erik, thanks so much for taking the time to share your knowledge with us. I'll pass it over to you.
Super, thank you, Haley. Hello, everybody. Just going to queue up my presentation here. Okay, can you see that?
Yep, that's good.
Okay, super. So I'm a forestry consultant, but I've been working for the community forest in Harrop-Procter for 17 years as the manager. So I'm going to be speaking with my my Harrop-Procter forest manager hat on. I also do other consulting work, and mostly in the West Kootenays these days, related to the kind of material I'll be talking about here. Okay, so here we are. For those of you who are not super familiar with the location of the west arm of Kootenay Lake, zooming in, there we are. Harrop-Procter Community Forest is, you'll see Nelson in the bottom left corner. The community forest runs from West Arm Park, which runs all the way from Nelson to the pink outline. The community forest runs from there all the way over to Kootenay Lake. At the north end, it's all private land that goes up a moderate ways up the hillside. So the community forest, it's about 11,300 hectares, and it goes all the way from close to the lake to the height of land. Includes 4 main watersheds, including Harrop Creek and Procter Creek. Another big one is Narrows Creek. They're all watersheds that the folks in Harrop-Procter drink out of. There are about 600 to 800 people in the Harrop-Procter area. And other than a couple people who are on wells, everybody's drinking straight out of the creeks, typical Kootenay situation. Our forests are fire origin almost entirely from turn of the previous century fires. And the landscape you can see there in the photo is typical of our area, unless it has recently burned a vast green carpet of 100-year-old forest. And of course, fire has been excluded from the landscape until very recently. So a little context on the social side for the community forest. The community forest was born out of the War in the Woods of the 80s and 90s. These are photos taken at a major protest in Harrop in 91, I believe, 91, 92, the year before Clayoquot Sound erupted. So that's the backstory. There was industrial logging planned in the watersheds, and a lot of people were not very comfortable or happy with that idea, and there were blockades. This is, I call this sort of the phase of sort of black and white pro versus con forestry, logging, environmentalism. And that is the origin of our community forest, because, I'll just go back here, because the community forest is a watershed-based group, and I'll get to that in a second. Just switching back to the land for a second, here's a zoom in of what our forests look like 20 years ago. A lot of them still look like that. The dense 100-year-old forests you can see in that slide, a little bit of mountain pine beetle cropping up in the headwaters of Procter Creek there, if your resolution's good enough. And yeah, so fire has returned to our landscape. After no major fires from the 30s until 2003, there was a big fire in Kettle Creek, burned into the headwaters of Harrop Creek and threatened the community, was on evacuation alert for several weeks. That was the same year as the Kootenay wildfire and many others. And then another big wildfire year, there was a lightning strike just in the top right corner of this image, actually ended up burning about 3,000 hectares, mostly in the community forest. So yeah, fire's back, and I'll be talking about that. Okay, now I'm going back to the social side. So following the war in the woods, park was created, West Arm Park, and it excluded the watersheds of Harrop-Procter, which was a bit ironic for the people who'd been protesting and advocating for a park. And the community forest was actually originally a plan B for many of those folks. And it just so happened that in the late 90s, there was an opportunity in the first NDP government's go around there's an opportunity to apply for a community forest, which was a brand new program at the time, was a pilot program. So the Watershed Protection Society organized itself and put in a 3-inch binder, applying along with dozens and dozens of other communities across the province. And the community forest was the second one awarded in the province. We are now a not-for-profit cooperative. That's how we're structured. We have over 280 members. Remember that there's only maybe 800 people living in Harrop-Procter in the summer. So we have quite a large, maybe there's 250 to 300 households in the community. Our objectives coming out of the watershed-based advocacy, water protection, drinking water protection has always been number one, and very tightly linked with our ecosystem-based forestry approach, which I'll be talking about. Local employment has always followed behind that. We do have a small sawmill in Harrop, as well as all the local forestry employment that is generated from our small business. And community wildfire protection has been a big issue, not surprisingly, for the past 20 years. And in 2010, we wrote climate change adaptation into our goals and objectives as well. Okay, that's the context. I'm going to be speaking for the rest of the presentation about a project that I've been leading in the community forest for the past several years that is about taking the broad concepts of adaptation, climate change adaptation, wildfire risk reduction, that sort of thing, and operationalizing it in our community forest as a pilot study. We received funding, the project received funding from the community forest and from Columbia Basin Trust, and through the Columbia Basin Trust funding, there's a significant outreach component of which this presentation could be considered a part. So I think most people on this webinar will agree that there is lots and lots of talk and concerns and ideas about climate change and what to do about it. I have found that there's not very much systematic action, at least in the forestry sector, not yet, despite the fact that it's been something we've been talking about for 10 or 15 years quite extensively. So the objective of what I'll be speaking about is to try to connect the theory and the broad principles of climate change adaptation with actual examples of what it could look like on the ground. Okay, so for example, you'll see a lot of promote resilient species as guidance to forest managers. Well, okay, which species and where, based on what ecosystems? Partial cut dry sites. Well, what does that mean, partial cut? Where and how? That sort of thing. So that's what I'll be getting into. So that's what this project is about. It's sort of a zooming into a specific land base as a pilot study. There is a project advisory committee for the project, especially in the startup phase. I won't list everyone who's on the committee. You can see them here. They include consulting ecologists and foresters and biologists, as well as Ministry of Forests staff and industry representatives as well, small, medium, and large industry. So the idea was that there would be, big ecological brains in behind it to help me as a manager make sure that what I was doing was on track with the ecology of our area, as well as government and industry folks to keep it real and applied. Okay, there's a couple premises. This is the only slide that's going to, well, maybe there's only 2 slides about that actually show climate change on a graph. I'm not even going to get into the specifics because people have seen slides like this so much. This slide here shows the increase in spring flows in Redfish Creek, which is right across the west arm from Narrows Creek in the community forest. April flows up 73%, September flows down 42%. That's the kind of thing that scares a lot of us for obvious reasons. So this is the last slide I'll have about climate science in this presentation. I just put it into 4 bullets. This is what the science provincially and local regional experts downscaling climate models have given me. Warmer, potentially likely wetter springs, falls and winters, and drier, hotter summers, more average annual area burned as we're seeing, and more extreme precipitation events and extreme events in general. Okay, that's the context. The premise is we know all that already. The other premise that I have is that we already have enough high-level direction from the province, from regional folks, from big industry. Everyone's got a strategy, but most of the strategies are still at very high level, in my experience. And the other premise is that the values and the concerns of the community forest, which has been in operation for over 20 years, those haven't changed. They're still protecting domestic water, trying to have some local sustainable jobs, maintaining biodiversity, and protecting the community from wildfire. That's what it's all about. So that it's not the objectives change, it's how we try to address them. So I'll be talking about the 3 parts of our project. One is risk assessment, which I'll be getting into. I'll go through that fairly quickly, but it's very important. Operation strategy is probably what most people will find the most relatable, which is getting into examples of how we're applying adaptation on the ground and in the watersheds. And I'll touch briefly on our management planning and annual allowable cut scenarios. So, I have a how, a where, a how, and a how fast as the questions, because the risk assessment is really about prioritizing areas, because there's so much change happening on the landscape. It can be overwhelming. It is overwhelming. And we need to do triage in some cases to decide where to put our energy, because we only have so much time and resources. So risk assessment, I used a standard risk assessment methodology, looking at probability and consequence. Probability specifically in this case of fire and drought, and consequence to the 4 values of primary concern in the community forest. You could have other values that you could be following as well, but I kept it relatively streamlined for this purpose. This sort of a proof of concept approach. Okay, don't worry about this slide if you don't like slides like this. I'm just sort of orienting where the risk assessment is in relation to hazards and values. If you're really interested in this, I suggest you look at the recording of this presentation later and look in detail. I just thought I'd throw it up here because some people really like this slide and probably most people don't. So it's in there. It's showing where the risk assessment fits. Okay. Risk doesn't exist without a value at risk. So that's the 4 values that we're mapping. So I'm looking at the consequence side of the risk assessment. Water values, low, moderate, high. This is primarily thinking about drinking water values. You can see that the high value areas, the areas where if they were impacted, the consequences would be high. Those areas are headwaters areas and riparian areas primarily, because that's the areas that most strongly influence water quantity and quality and timings of flow. Timber values, very different location on the landscape. They're closer to the community, they're higher volume stands, they have potential for access, or they have access. They're in a very different place on the landscape than the water values. So anytime you look at someone with a single picture of a risk assessment, says this is the areas at risk, I strongly suggest looking at, okay, this is areas at risk in regards to which value, because the water values are in one place and the timber values are in a different place, just for example. Okay, now getting into the probability side of the risk equation. So we used the actual soil moisture regime part of biogeoclimatic mapping and ecosystem science. I'll explain that very briefly. And we started by taking our terrestrial ecosystem mapping and mapping the actual soil moisture of each of those sites. Now, this is where climate change comes in. Don't worry about the numbers. The colors kind of help you. Obviously, as it gets warmer and drier, the amount of moisture available to plants to grow in the growing season is becoming less. Drought stress is becoming higher. And so if you just look at the top line here, you'll see previous climate, or what's considered the current climate, but it's already passed. You'll see some slightly less scary colors. And then as we go into the 2085, you'll see that the same site drops from a 4, which I've circled there as a sort of slightly dry, to a moderately dry or significantly dry. And that happens all the way through all of our ecosystems. Each ecosystem type that we have in our community forest we placed in this graph, you see each of them are getting drier, although the driest ones are the ones that are drying the most, and the wettest ones aren't changing very much. So that's a key learning, is that the areas that are already droughty are the ones that are having the stronger impacts from climate change. And this is from the provincial modeling and local provincial ecologists. Okay. That last slide is kind of complicated. This is just to visualize it. Here's the community forest, 11,000 hectares going from the lake to the height of land. Here's absolute soil moisture regime 1990. Here it is 2055. And here it is 2085. So this is based on actual field-based science sampling and done by ecologists. Okay. That's the amount of drought that we have and are expecting on each of our sites. Then, of course, each tree species has a different susceptibility to drought. For example, cedar is not very drought tolerant, although it's more drought tolerant than hemlock. But it's, fir, larch, and ponderosa are the most drought tolerant. So this is some work looking at individual species and what their drought tolerances is. Of course, as it gets drier, they get closer to the red zone, many of them. So just one slide of the drought probability based on all that I've just been talking about. Here's where drought is very likely to be significantly impacting the current tree species mix in 2085. So you take the drought levels, you take the tree species, this is what you end up with risk. This points us towards the areas that are likely to die off or be susceptible to other forest health issues in the coming decades. Okay, that was the drought piece. Now the fire piece. Fire probability I'm defining as the likelihood of high severity fire occurring if fire touched that site. We've had lightning strikes all over the community forest, high elevation, low elevation, every valley. It will likely strike in a it strikes in a close to apparently random pattern. So I won't get into the specifics again, but we looked at the fire probabilities based on fuels and slope aspect, that kind of thing, and whether it was a dead forest or not currently. A lot of red there. The only part that isn't red is the area that has already burned, or a few wet sites, or the pink in the northern portion there are previously harvested, primarily partial cut sites, which have now got lower densities and more sustainable species on them. Okay, this is the slide that I said 10 minutes ago, beware of. It's the slide that summarizes the entire risk assessment into one slide. So we're mashing together all the values and all the probabilities to point us towards the areas that in aggregate are at highest risk of impacts from climate change. Interestingly, these areas are primarily at lower elevations, primarily on droughty sites, coarse textured soils, that sort of thing. Okay, end of the risk assessment stuff. That tends to be the wonky stuff. We have certain areas that it points out are the highest risk values to us, and the locations of them, because this is prioritizing certain areas for management. Now we're going to get into the how. Okay, this is the stuff that's a little more tangible. I'm going to talk about the operations strategy given where the risks are located and what those risks are. So I have found it recently very helpful to think of the different types of strategies we can choose to use in relation to the threats posed or the risks from climate change. We can choose resistance type strategies, which are more protecting what we have, especially if it's of high value. Or we can choose a realignment or transition strategy, which is more of a proactive accepting that change will happen and potentially not exactly facilitating it, but working with the change that's coming. So if we are resisting, we don't want a fire to burn down homes. We don't want a fire to burn down high value old growth forests, for example. So we might be putting fuel breaks around those areas. We will be protecting old and riparian forests. We'll have reserve networks. On the realignment side, which is really works hand in hand with the resistance side, or is the flip side, we're looking at actively changing forest structure, new stalking standards, that sort of thing. So I'll talk about examples of both of these in a bit. Okay, I find this slide also helpful. Resilience is there in the middle between resistance and transition as you move towards facilitating adaptive responses or promoting change. Resilience, I find, is a word that's used very heavily, and in the context of what we're talking about here, I think it's helpful to think of resilience in a large landscape context, not on a site-by-site context, whereas we can think of resistance or transition more at the site level or at the landscape level. And I throw this out there because the USDA uses this concept quite a bit, and I find it quite helpful. Okay, operations strategy. So the context is that a resistance approach is sort of like rowing upstream or swimming upstream. However, it's worth doing at times. Let's talk about carbon. Let's talk about mature forests, old forests. We want to have lots of carbon kept on the landscape, ideally. We would like to have lots of older forests around, ideally. However, if you look at the current and future carrying capacity of our sites in the southern interior in relation to carbon or old trees, there is a capacity issue here, and the capacity is dropping. The maximum conifer, maximum carbon stocks in our community forest was in 2003, before the wildfire and the pine beetle. It's been dropping ever since. Has nothing to do with our logging. or maybe 2% of it's that. The rest of it is these natural changes. So we have to think a lot about where we can hold carbon, where we can resist. Okay, this is from our management plan. We have 60 to 70% of our land base in reserves already. The upper elevations are caribou habitat. They're inoperable, hard to get to. There's some old growth in there that we are not going to disturb. There's a lot of reasons why we can't work or shouldn't work or have chosen not to work in the upper elevation. So the context of all of our operations is that we're not going to be operating in a large portion of the community forest. However, you will see that the green areas on this map very closely align with the highest risk areas in the community forest in terms of our values. So that gives us an opportunity to be proactive in some of these areas. Okay, on the resistant side of the spectrum of adapting to climate change. Fuel breaks, fuel treatments, that's a fairly obvious one. Here, all the different shades of green are either completed or in progress fuel treatment areas where we're trying to get a fuel break all the way across from Harrop in the left to Procter on the right. In the community forest, these would be low fuel areas, whether that treatment's been done by hand or with machinery. We also have some landscape level fuel breaks that we're looking at building. I'll give some specifics. This is something I've been working on for over a decade. So a few examples. There's a couple of old roads in the community forest from the 60s that provide access into areas that otherwise have no access. And we're not an over-roaded landscape like some areas. We're an area that has actually very few roads. And without road access, there's not much ability to protect a watershed like Procter Creek, which is all 100-year-old coniferous or older forest. There's not much opportunity to protect it from a wildfire. We've built some helipads before they're needed because I've worked on fires and specifically the 2017 fire, and it's like, where's the roads, where's the helipads? Here's a couple of examples of fire guards that were built during the 2017 wildfire that I laid out. On the top one, it's part of a 2-kilometer guard that went along the ridge, and then the bottom one's part of a 4-kilometer guard that went cross slope. This is fairly straightforward stuff here. Here's a image of what some of those landscape fuel breaks look like in terms of their location. The fire is in the background there. You can see the 2017 machine guard it stopped the fire from moving further north into the community. This is all just proactive forestry planning here. Aerial view of what a fuel break could look like. This is one we put in about over 10 years ago now. Okay, realignment. There's a beautiful fir vet, probably 300 years old, 250 anyways, multiple fire scars, and obviously was not surrounded by young cedar for a large portion of its life, but it is now. Here's a location in the wildland urban interface within a couple hundred meters of people's homes. We have big-ish fir and larch, but we also have very heavy cedar hemlock understory and mid-canopy fuels on a site that is getting drier. So we need to think about what we can do about these sites. So if we take this site, very dense, continuous fuels horizontally and vertically, and the cedar and hemlock that's on this site is not well suited at all to the climate that we're already getting and that we're going to be having. So what's our desired future condition on this site if we choose to manage it? Again, don't worry about specifics, but we're looking at targeting certain species and densities, fuel loads, reserve areas, that kind of thing, with specific targets of how much area we want to cover in our timber harvesting land base, which is the area we might potentially work in over the next couple decades. Here's an example of that one site. It's a partial cut harvest done a few winters ago. Lower slide is what it looked like just after that partial cut. This is sort of in the nomenclature of that last graph I showed, sort of somewhere between, I would say, sort of resistance and resilience, with a little bit of realignment. Here's what it looks like a year later. after some pile burning and a little bit of cleanup. Fires in the 2017 fires in the background. Here's another site in Harrop Creek, west-facing site. It was primarily dead pine. 15 years ago, we went in and removed the dead and dying pine and some of the understory cedar hemlock, left the larger, healthier fir larch. So this is a partial cut stand. This stand has now been, it's now as ready as it can be for future fire and drought. Also, when you're doing this work, you need to think about the connectivity of your work. So this is, if you're getting on the Harrop Ferry, this is what you would see if it wasn't wintertime. There's some logging there in the middle, partial cut. In fact, the last photo was taken from that spot. And then there's a landscape level fuel break that we're working on to go up the ridge between West Arm Park and the community. Okay, now a couple slides from other areas where I work. I also work for the Spokane Community Forest, which is also a not-for-profit watershed-based co-op. I've been working specifically on reintroduction of fire into that landscape, working on some ecosystem restoration and wildfire risk reduction plans and operations. This is a burn that the BC Wildfire Service, in cooperation with the Spokane Community Forest, pulled off 2 years ago, coming on 2 years ago. On a dry south-facing slope. This is another project I've worked on with BC Parks. This is just up at the back end of Swoboda Road, just a mile outside of Nelson. We did a partial cut in a pine, fir larch, cedar hemlock mix, and then we did an understory burn. BC Wildfire Service carried out the burn. The biologist and consulting foresters such as myself came up with the plan with BC Wildfire Service to do a light understory burn. Okay, also stalking standards. That's often talked about in forestry. Oh yeah, we're doing stuff about climate change. We've got some different stalking standards, which is great. It's one piece of it. So I've worked on both partial cut and even age stalking standards for the West Kootenays. This is an example of partial cut stalking standards. This is when if you go in and you are logging on a site and you may have an objective of regeneration, what is the standard that you're trying to meet? Obviously now we're looking at trying to have a more drought and fire tolerant landscape in areas that are prone to drought and fire, such as this ecosystem here. Here's some tree planters. Top right is what a lot of our stands look like, and bottom right is just some ponderosa pine. We have started, 13 years ago, 12 years ago, started planting our first ponderosa pine in the community forest just to mix in with the fir and larch. Ponderosa pine is entirely native, but is very quite uncommon due to the history of fire exclusion in the community forest. Okay, last step. I'm only going to have one slide on this one. So we've talked about the risk assessment, so the prioritization piece. We've talked about the operations strategy, which is the what exactly are we going to do where piece. And now there's also the question, well, how fast do we want to do this in terms of if the doing this involves going in and thinning stands and that. There's no simple answer to that. I believe that cut level, annual allowable cut is a social choice based on which values are most of concern and what risks are, and we have to make a decision. So we're currently running scenarios of what higher drought levels and mortality as a result of drought what the impacts of that are likely to be on the timber supply, and hence the long-term viability of the business side of our community forest. And so we're looking here at sort of how fast do we want to move? And I won't get into the answer, like if someone has a question about that, I'd be happy to talk about that. It gets pretty technical, but essentially we need to be looking at timber supply from a scenario-based approach, not just we have a black box that says how fast trees grow historically, and we'll just plug in our land base and it'll tell us what the sustainable cut is, and we'll just do that same amount for 250 years, which is how traditionally timber supply is conceived, that doesn't really make sense in the context of climate change, and it doesn't make sense in the southern interior in a small area-based tenure, in my view. So this project, I'm just wrapping up here. This project has an outreach component. We've put together a series of educational films, 4 of them. They're on YouTube. If you Google Harrop-Procter wildfire videos, you can find them, or on our website. There's a number of presentations that I'm giving, and there will be a handbook that will be coming out describing this in the coming few months. So that's my very, very fast run through of our project and our community forest, what we're doing about adapting to climate change. I went through it very fast, and I apologize for those who may think it was too fast, but I wanted to leave time for questions and discussion. And, you know, if you want to follow up with me as needed later, that's also fine. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now and ask Haley if she can moderate or jump us into the questions here.
Thanks, Erik. That was great. Nice work. I know it's a lot of material to cover, and you know, some really complex stuff in there. It's hard to, I'm sure, decide what to go over quickly and what to delve into in more detail. But you've left a lot of time for questions, which is great. So we'll be able to fill in the blanks here now. So folks, if you just came in a little bit later, what we're doing is we are instructing people to put their questions in the chat. And then I'm going to relay questions to Erik, and we'll get to as many of them as best we can. And just while we're waiting for questions to populate here, I'm sure there's going to be no shortage of them. I'll just say that some of those more complex sort of charts and graphs that Erik said we've seen so many of in relation to climate change. If you haven't seen many of those and you are curious, last year's CRED Talks delved into that quite deeply. So there were 8 speakers, I believe, who focused specifically on climate disruption in the Upper Columbia. So if you go to that same webpage, all those talk recordings are there, and you could learn more about that. Okay, so let's start with this question. So it says, you work at a community forest. How has the local community responded to your climate change initiative?
Yes, so this is one project which has a very large bearing on the direction our community forest is going. I've been the manager for 17 years. Climate change was not a big part of the discussion when I started working there, although wildfire was certainly starting to. As a not-for-profit cooperative, where I think the majority of households in the community own a share of the business, it's a pretty well-informed community as a whole in terms of forestry issues. So there's a lot of pre-existing knowledge and interest in general in the community in terms of forestry issues, and climate change, I think, is on many people's minds. The fact that we've had 2 major wildfires in 20 years, putting the community on evacuation alert for multiple weeks each time, definitely piques the interest and attention of everyone. So the fact that this, a significant portion of this project speaks to the wildfire issue is relevant and draws a lot of people in. I find that the most valuable part is having these discussions around resistance and realignment and how we make those choices, and understanding, let's say, community wildfire protection in this broader context. So I would say that there's, you know, it's a community-owned business. The jobs are local, the risks are local, and it keeps it all close to home. So, you know, we get a lot of interest, a lot of questions. People don't always want to come out to meetings, but that's the nature of. I see Vicky, who lives across the street from the office, and whose husband Terry was on the board for many years, and I think Vicky was too, smiling. I see Katie Hill is also on the board, smiling. There's a lot of meetings in the community forest side of things, and that's because it's a community-based enterprise. So anyways, that's sort of an aside, but there's a lot of community interest in this work.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Eric. So I just want to add that as I read out these questions, if I pronounce something wrong or you want to add in another detail or any such thing, please feel free to turn your camera on and unmute yourself and correct me in any way. Yeah, you're welcome to be interactive in this component. Okay, so I've got a question here from Tyne, and she says, how often do you reevaluate the results of your investigations, or sorry, your interventions against the defined values?
So sort of speaking to the monitoring and maybe the adaptive sort of feedback loop there. Any areas where we have been active on the landscape, meaning doing something since our inception 22 years ago, we go back to repeatedly. There's not a single site that we've worked on that we've sort of said, okay, good enough or whatever. Partly that's because of silviculture concerns and requirements. But we definitely are looking back, like what's the health of the trees that we left? How are the young trees doing? Are we getting the deciduous response that we're hoping to get? That's a big thing. I didn't actually speak to it. We're often trying to encourage deciduous to come back in. So we're quite closely watching how that's happening. And because we've done a number of partial cuts and entries now for 20 years, we're learning as we go and saying, well, that didn't work so well there. Maybe that's because wind throw is an example. Like we're really having to be careful around wind throw, either leaving an area alone or accepting a certain amount of wind throw, really leaving the most wind from trees in place. That's been a big adaptation we've had to make because the windstorms are also getting worse. So that's a big complicating factor. Yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like you're doing sort of really fine scale, and then also, I guess, looking at the broad scale once you add up all that fine scale together and the little adjustments.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification. So yeah, I'm speaking like a typical stand-based forester there in answering that question. Because that's where so much of the work happens. We're also looking at, like you saw those maps of the entire community forest and how's our progress on the landscape level fuel breaks, what percent are we done, what's the age class and species distribution evolving to become through natural disturbance on the land base as a whole. We also do, I should have mentioned this, we also do water monitoring on all of our main creeks. So we have for Harrop Creek and Narrows Creek, close to 20 years of water monitoring data. I should have mentioned that earlier. So we are also watching the flows and how they're responding to climate change and fires and our work and that sort of thing.
Great, thanks, Tyne. Thanks, Eric. Okay, so I have a question here from Mark and Mara. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly. We stopped by the HP Community Lumber Mill and we saw that you have some biochar kilns on site. We're interested in the possibility of biochar financing some of these needed forestry advances. Any thoughts on this?
Yeah, we have a small sawmill, which has slabs that are produced. And on one side of the equation, we have to do something with them because they're a waste product from the sawmill. And of course, biochar can be used as a soil amendment. And we have done some experimentation down at the mill. I'm not the expert on it. You'd want to talk to David Strom, actually, is the person down at the mill who maybe you spoke to about this. We've got a couple of small burners, and we're experimenting with, how feasible it is to be making biochar as a way to turn a waste product into a useful product with minimal smoke. So it's at the investigation stage. It's not at there's not a strong business case figured out for it yet, but that we're actively working on that as part on our sawmilling side of our operation. And I'll also mention, you could also be bringing some of that biochar, you could be bringing it back into the woods. That's as a soil amendment in the woods, although it's primarily used. Right now, it's being used like mixed with chicken manure to go on people's gardens, that kind of.
That's neat, thanks. Okay, question from Angela. Do you have areas where you focus on one of the specific values to determine the efficacy of the different intervention or treatment on the separate values?
Yeah, that's a good question, because we've got four main values that I'm talking about. So let's take water and timber, are maybe the most easy to contrast because of their different location, different ways you manage for them typically. We definitely, part of I didn't show the sort of thought process algorithm for each sort of site, but we look at in which areas are, where are the values most significant? So in a riparian area, or for example, water is going to be the most important value. Right next to someone's house on a dry site, houses are going to be the most significant value. So we definitely have a higher and lower priority on those different values depending on the location. Every location is different. So the water value exists throughout the community forest, although certain sites are really, for example, like a coarse textured north or west aspect site at low to mid elevations in our watersheds is not highly what happens on that site does not actually highly impact our peak flows or our low flows. It doesn't impact the quality of the water unless it's a high landslide risk area. So areas like that, water is an important value, but we would have to make sure we have a high degree of confidence that we're not going to compromise that value by doing our timber management or our fire management. So I would say water is the one that we can't ever sort of drop off. Timber is relevant whenever there's timber being extracted, but in many cases, the timber is a byproduct of a fuel treatment. And it's not really the driving force. However, we need to not lose money. So we either need to, accept that we'll lose some money or make the money somewhere else or get funding programs to help pay for it. So yeah, every single watershed, every single site has a different balance of values.
Yeah, it's not simple.
No, it's not simple. But that's what makes it fun, right? That's what makes it really interesting.
Yeah. Okay, so this is what I'm going to suggest. Denise, you have a fairly long comment and a bit of a question. I want you to think about what your question is, and then we're going to circle back to you. So I'm going to ask Shauna's question. I'm going to relay that one. And then Denise, I suggest that you unmute yourself when we're ready. I'll call on you and you can ask your question, okay? So let's go to Shauna. So we're exploring values-based management at a landscape level and using adaptive management or mitigation to manage for competing values. Do you have an example of competing values in your risk assessment and prioritization of actions or planning for those competing values?
Yes. Okay. One example would be an old growth forest that is near the community or that is close or part of an area that's a high priority for a landscape level fuel break. So here we have a rare ecosystem type with specific biodiversity values, which may or may not be compatible with any kind of active forest management. So we are definitely picking some sites like the let's say the more cedar hemlock old growth forest, not that we have much of it at all. We committed to not ever going into any of those stands unless it was an extremely light treatment along an existing edge or something very specific. So you have to make your choices there. Even if you'd like to reduce the risk in that stand because of its rarity as an older forest, there are certain cases where we just won't. But what we're doing is, in that case, there's some of those stands, well, there's actually a dry site just adjacent that's fine on the ridge. And if we do a fuel treatment there, we reduce the risk of fire impact that old growth stand in the first place, and we can get our landscape level fuel break in through avoiding that old growth forest. There's also one small area of a west-facing slope with more of a fir larch, not very old forest, but a little bit old forest, where it has cedar hemlock undergrowth, and we're doing a fuel treatment in there, maintaining all the old forest values while doing a fuel treatment, because in that case, they're compatible. They're not always compatible, but sometimes they are compatible because of the forest structure and the fact this was historically more of a fire maintained or low to mixed severity fire location. A certain amount of fuel treatment is defensible, in fact, desirable to improve the resilience of a site like that. So sometimes there's tensions that work together, and sometimes there's tensions that don't work together, and you just have to make your choice.
Right, and so the societal values are what make that shift and change and choice to accept the risk, or
yes. So we have mapped where the water values are the highest. So those are the areas where we'll place the top priority on water. It's not that we won't manage for other things at the same time, but that's going to be at the top. And yes, it is a social choice. Ultimately, most of these things are social choices. Even our choice to manage for old growth or biodiversity or water, they're ultimately, they boil down to choices that people are making. And the way I rationalize that a little bit or understand that is that we managed our way into this situation by excluding fires and creating climate change. So like it or not, the landscape we have out my window and out everyone else's window is impacted by human activity. So we got ourselves here. Now we can't wash our hands and say, well, we'll just stay away from it now and that'll be good. Maybe it will be, maybe it won't, but that's not a very, certainly not proactive, and I don't think it's actually a responsible way to think about our ecosystem. You know, we got ourselves here, we got to make active management decisions to get out. Even if those active management decisions are, we're not going to do anything and we'll accept the risks of natural disturbances. That's fine, but that's a decision.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. Okay, thanks, Eric. So we're short on time now. It's 12:59. We were going to aim to end by 1, but I'll stay good on my promise. Denise, why don't you share your question now? And then I think we'll cut it off from there. Ian does have a question in the chat. If we don't get to that one, I'll send it to Eric by email.
Yeah.
Okay, so Denise, are you there?
Yep.
Okay, go for it.
Thanks very much, everyone. And thank you, Eric, for a great talk and all the work you're doing. Bottom line, in a nutshell, we can't afford the carbon emissions from slash burning. I also don't think it should be called slash, but residue or something. So I know it's better than a full-on forest fire for carbon emissions, but why can't we chip in situ or come up with other ways that are not slash burning to deal with this potential fire hazard and reduce emissions and increase our costs so we're not having the softwood lumber dispute with the states from our subsidization, no?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And we're definitely doing everything we can so far to reduce burning through, for example, increased utilization of low value materials, going to the pulp mill rather than burning them on site. We have done a small amount of chipping. Unfortunately, most of our sites are too steep to physically get a chipper that we currently have access onto that site. We're doing what we can, and we definitely have reduced the burning significantly. We have to make a choice at times to choose to emit a relatively limited amount of carbon now to try to reduce a large amount of carbon emissions later. Just for context, in 3 days, the Harrop-Procter wildfire, the 2017 wildfire burned in 3 days more land than our community forest has even touched in 20 years. So the scale of what we're doing versus the scale of what a wildfire can done and has done in 20 years in our community forest is just like, it's like 1,000,000 to 1 almost, at least 10,000 to 1, you know, in terms of on a daily or yearly impact as far as what we're doing. So we just have to, I agree, we have to absolutely be doing our best, but we also have to consider where can we carry carbon on the landscape and where is carbon above what the landscape can hold in the long term.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that. I'm going to sneak this question in, see if you can give a quick answer.
Okay.
So Ethan asks, given birch decline in the region, do you think it should have a place in our WRR regeneration or deciduous field break efforts?
You know, I haven't given up on birch. Yes, it has been declining heavily and it's impacted by a lot of things, including drought. We're always going to have birch around, and even if it only lasts for 20 or 30 years before it dies, that still is a great thing. It's great for the soil. It's great for the risk reduction. It's great for wildlife. I don't think we should count on just birch. You know, in most cases, it's birch and aspen and deciduous shrubs, non-tree species. So we don't count on it as a timber species or count on it as to carry everything, but definitely birch, I think personally, I feel it has a place. It always has, and I think it always will. Just like lodgepole pine, it's always been here. It'll never go away. It's a tough tree.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much. It's a lot to tackle, but you did great. I'm just going to take over the screen share here briefly and do some formal thank yous and wrap up. Thanks everybody for contributing to, being here for one thing, and contributing to the discussion and the questions. This is probably the point, Eric, when you want to look at the chat, because you'll have some accolades coming in, I'm sure. So just a thanks from CMI, thanks from KCP and our funders. So we have the Columbia Basin Trust, of course, and then all of KCP's core funders that allow them to do their very important work. So many thanks. And a bit of a teaser for our very last talk. So next week, we're ending on a bit of a different note. So we've been talking a lot about fire with regards to ecosystem resilience. And next week, we're going to go and we're going to talk about wildlife. So we'll be welcoming Clayton Lamb, and he'll be delivering a talk called Tales of Taking Evidence Through to Conservation Action for Two Iconic Mountain Dwellers, the Caribou and the Grizzly Bear. So he's involved in lots of really interesting work with lots of partners on pretty large scale. It should be a pretty interesting talk. So if you're not already registered, of course, go to our website or KCP's website for the registration. And if you miss it and you want to catch it, we'll have the recordings posted as well as this one. So we'll get it up within a few days. And let us know what you think of the series. We'll provide an opportunity for you to weigh in on how you think the series has been and any suggestions for what we might tackle in the future. Thanks for the engaging discussion. And Eric, thanks so much for your time and sharing your knowledge and your experience. Very much appreciated.
Thanks, everybody. And it's easy to find me through the Community Forest website, Google search, whatever. So I'm happy to follow up with anyone who wants to follow up directly.
Perfect. Okay, great. Thanks. That's all. We'll end it from here. Thanks, everybody.